He was 31 years old the night the shooting started in Dry Creek, and by the time the smoke cleared, he was the only man still standing who had come in through that back door. No partners, no share, no plan for the money, just a canvas sack heavier than any horse he ever carried, and a stretch of dark timber to bury it in before dawn. 40 years he waited to come back. But what nobody knew, not the sheriff, and not the two witnesses still living, was that the ground itself had kept a secret of its own. Settle in with me, and let me know where you're watching from, before we go any further. Daniel Carter was born in a sod-walled dugout on the west edge of the Kansas grass, in the winter of a year nobody in his family bothered to write down, and by the time he was old enough to remember faces, there were only two he could count on. His mother, Mercy, was a thin woman with river-colored eyes, who taught him to read from the back pages of a seed catalog, and his father, a wagon blacksmith named Owen Carter, was a man who never raised his voice and never once broke a promise Daniel could recall. They lost Mercy to a summer fever when Daniel was 9, and after that, his father went quieter still, the way certain men do when grief settles in them, like sediment in a jar of well water. Owen kept the forge going another 11 years, and in those years he taught his son every honest thing he knew: how to draw a horseshoe from a cold bar, how to shoe a mule that didn't want shoeing, how to read weather off the smell of stone, and how to keep your hands busy when your mind wanted to eat you alive. Daniel took to it. He was not a large boy, but he was steady, and steadiness in a smith is worth more than size. By the time he was 17, he could shoe a nervous colt without a second man on the halter, and by 19, he was drawing hinges and hasps and small ironwork that the country wives paid cash for and hung in their kitchens like ornaments. His mentor after Owen was a widower named Rennick Halloran, a Missouri-born farrier who came west after burying a wife and a son on the same day, and who took Daniel on as an apprentice the summer he turned 20. Rennick was a slow-moving man, with hands like split leather, and a habit of humming old church tunes without knowing he was doing it, and he treated Daniel the way an older brother treats a younger one who has already been through too much. He taught Daniel the parts of the trade Owen had never gotten to: the finer bench work, the tempering of small blades, the patience it takes to file a hoof true when the light is failing and the animal is tired. He also taught him, without ever quite saying so, that a man's word was the only piece of property nobody could take from him without his permission. Rennick lived alone in a 2-room shop above the creek at Bellwether Crossing, and on the winter evenings when the work was done, he would pour 2 cups of chicory coffee and sit across the table from Daniel and say almost nothing, and Daniel came to understand that silence between men who trusted each other was its own kind of conversation. Rennick died the spring Daniel was 26. He was found seated at his bench, with his hammer still in his hand, and the doctor from the next town over said it was his heart, and there had been no pain in it. In the drawer of the workbench, Rennick had left a folded square of oilcloth, with Daniel's name written on the outside in pencil, and inside was a pocket knife, with an antler handle, and a brass bolster worn smooth from 40 years of use. There was no letter. There didn't need to be. Daniel carried that knife every day after. In his right front pocket, edge closed, weight familiar as a second heartbeat. And he carried it still on the night 5 years later, when a man he barely knew talked him into riding down to Dry Creek to stand watch outside a bank office that was said to hold more paper money than any building for 100 miles. He was 31. He had lost the 2 people who had ever loved him without asking anything back, and he had a trade that could feed him but could not fill the room he lived in. And when the offer came, he told himself he would take his share and buy a little piece of ground somewhere quiet and set up a forge of his own. That was the story he told himself on the ride down. It was still the story he was telling himself when he pushed open the back door of the office and heard the first shot break the glass above his head. What happened inside the office took less than a minute, and Daniel could never afterward assemble it into anything that made sense. There were 4 men who came in through the front, and 2 who came in through the back, and by the time the shooting stopped, there was 1 man still on his feet, and that man was Daniel Carter. He stood in the doorway with the pocket knife in his pocket and a Colt in his hand that he did not remember drawing, and the smell of burned powder was so thick it stung the inside of his nose, and the only sound was a clock somewhere in the front room, still ticking, as though nothing had happened at all. On the floor near the teller's cage lay a canvas sack tied with jute twine, and it had been dropped there by a man who no longer had any use for it. Daniel walked to the sack the way a man walks in a dream, slow and without deciding, and he lifted it by the twine and felt the weight of it in his shoulder and knew without counting that it was more money than his father had earned in all the years of the forge together. He stood in the middle of that room with the sack in his hand and looked at the faces of the men who had ridden down with him, and none of them looked back, and he understood in that moment that the life he had been living up to the pushing of that door was already gone from him, and no argument he could make, and no confession he could offer, would ever return it. He did not weep, he did not kneel. He walked out the back door the same way he had come in, and he closed it behind him with the same hand that had opened it, and he stepped over a man on the stoop whose name he had learned only that afternoon on the ride down. His horse was tied at the alley post where he had left it, and the horse was still there because horses do not know what has happened inside a building and only wait. He tied the sack behind the cantle with a leather thong from his own saddle, and he mounted, and he rode out of Dry Creek at a walk, because a walk did not attract the eye, and a gallop did, and he passed under the lamp at the corner of the livery, without turning his head. Nobody hailed him, nobody followed. The town was already tipping toward the noise of the office, boots on plank walks and voices rising, and Daniel Carter went the other way, out past the last picket fence, and into the dark, beyond the town's edge, where the road turned to 2 ruts in dry grass, and the ruts turned to nothing at all. He carried Rennick's knife in his right front pocket, and a canvas sack of stolen money behind his saddle, and no plan for either one. And the story he had told himself all the way down was a story he could not tell himself anymore. He rode north through the first hours of the night, at a walk that gave the horse its head, and the country opened around him the way country opens when a man does not know where he is going. The moon was 3/4, and it laid a pale wash over the grass, and made the sage stand up in low silver clumps, and once a coyote crossed the road ahead of him, and stopped, and looked back, and went on, and Daniel took no meaning from it, because he had no room left in him for meanings. He passed a windmill turning slowly against no wind he could feel, and he passed a fence line strung on cedar posts that leaned east from years of weather, and he passed the black shape of a soddy set, back from the track, with no light in its one window, and he did not stop at any of them. Toward morning he came into a stretch of dark timber along a creek whose name he did not know, and he turned the horse off the road and rode down through the pines until he could no longer see the road behind him, and there he dismounted and stood a long while in the cold, under the trees, listening for hooves and hearing only the creek and his own breath. The ground beneath the pines was soft with needles and the years, and a windfall had opened a long, shallow trough in the earth where the roots had lifted, and Daniel took a folding shovel from his roll and dug into that trough by the light of the setting moon. He dug until his shoulders burned, and until the sweat on his back went cold in the pre-dawn air, and then he laid the canvas sack into the hole and folded a piece of oilcloth over the top of it, the way Rennick had folded the oilcloth over the pocket knife in the drawer, and he covered the sack with dirt and needles, and then with a length of the rotted log itself, rolled back over the top. He marked the place in his mind by 3 trees, and a bend in the creek, and the angle of a limestone outcrop above the water, and he memorized those marks, the way his father had taught him to memorize the shape of a hoof before setting a shoe, and when he was done, he did not look back at the ground. He mounted and rode on out of the timber before the sun was fully up, and the horse was tired, and he was tired, and he did not stop again until he had crossed a low divide and put a second creek between himself and the buried sack. By then the sun was full up, and the country had turned to a wide floor of pale grass running west, and he understood that he was somewhere he had never been before, and would have to learn from the beginning. And he understood, too, that he could not go back to Bellwether Crossing, and he could not send word to any man who had known him there, because a man who walks out of a room where 5 other men have died does not walk back into the life he left behind that morning. He rode all that day with the sun climbing the sky behind him and then falling ahead of him, and he did not eat, and he drank once from a canteen and once from a shallow spring, where the horse drank longer than he did. Toward evening he came to the edge of a rimrock, and stood the horse, and looked down into a valley he had never seen, narrow and cupped between 2 ridges, with a thread of water running through it, and a stand of aspen turning at one end, and he thought, without deciding anything, that a man could disappear in a country like that for as long as he needed to. He stood the horse a long time at the rimrock, and watched the light drain out of the valley in slow bands. And when the shadow finally reached the aspen at the north end, he swung down and led the horse along the edge until he found a game trail that switched down through juniper and loose shale, and he came into the valley on foot at dusk, with the reins in his hand and the horse blowing softly behind him. The floor of the valley was flatter than it had looked from above, and the creek ran shallow over pale gravel, and a 1/4 mile up from where the trail spilled out, he saw the low black shape of a cabin, set back against the west ridge, under a lean of pines. He did not approach it that night. He watered the horse, hobbled it in the grass by the creek, and slept with his saddle for a pillow and the colt under the blanket, and he woke at gray light and walked up to the cabin with his rifle across his forearm and called out twice and got no answer. The door was rope-hinged and stood half open. He pushed it the rest of the way with the barrel of the rifle and stepped inside. The cabin was 1 room, maybe 14 feet by 16, built of squared pine logs chinked with clay that had crumbled out along the north wall in a long horizontal seam. The roof was sawed over split poles, and the sod had held except above the door, where a patch had let go, and the poles beneath it were dark with old rain. The floor was puncheon, 6 wide slabs adazed flat and pegged down, worn hollow in a shallow path from the door to the hearth. The hearth itself was fieldstone, laid dry, the mantel a single hewn beam blackened with smoke on its underside. There was a bedstead in the corner, made of peeled poles lashed with rawhide that had gone brittle, a 3-legged stool, a table of 2 boards on trestles, and a tin plate on the table, with a spoon laid across it, as if someone had gotten up to answer a knock at the door and never sat back down. A jacket hung on a peg by the door, canvas, small in the shoulders, the sleeves stiff with age. In the corner by the hearth stood a broom of tied willow, with the handle worn smooth in the middle. Under the eave outside, an axe was sunk in a chopping block and had rusted into it. He walked out and around the cabin and found a dug-out root cellar cut into the ridge behind it, roofed with the same sod, the door hanging on a single leather hinge. Inside the cellar, the shelves were empty, except for 2 clay crocks and the dry stems of onions, long since gone to dust. There was a pole corral behind that, sagging but standing, and a small spring boxed in with cedar planks, 50 feet up the slope, the water clear and slow. He walked the ground twice, looking, and he saw no grave and no name carved anywhere on the logs, and no track newer than a season, and he understood that whoever had lived here had gone out one day and had not come back, and no one had come after them to close the door. He led the horse up and put it in the corral, and mended the worst rail with a length of pine he cut from the deadfall behind the cellar, and by afternoon he had swept the cabin with the willow broom, and taken the tin plate off the table, and set it on the mantel, and he sat on the stool with Rennick's knife open in his hand, and looked at the floor and the walls, and the hearth, and understood, without saying it aloud, that he had come to a place. He did not touch the puncheon floor for 2 days. He mended the sod above the door with turves cut from the creek bank, and he rechinked the north seam with fresh clay, worked in his palms until it was the color of wet ash, and he cleaned the flue with a bundle of green willow tied to a pole. And only on the 3rd morning, when he laid a first small fire in the hearth, and the smoke drew clean, did he notice that one of the puncheon slabs by the hearth sounded different under his boot than the others. He knelt and set the point of Rennick's knife into the seam, and worked it, and found the peg had been cut off flush, and the slab was loose. He lifted it out and set it aside. Beneath it was a shallow pocket, dug into the earth and lined with flat creek stones, and in the pocket was an oilcloth bundle tied with the same jute twine that the canvas sack in Dry Creek had been tied with, and beside the bundle was a small tin box with a hinged lid. He lifted the bundle out first. It was heavier than it looked. He set it on the hearthstone and untied the twine and folded back the oilcloth in 4 careful movements, and found inside a stack of double eagles and a smaller stack of silver dollars and a folded square of paper on top, with a single word written on the outside in a slow, careful hand, and the word was whoever. He did not count the coins. He set the paper aside and opened the tin box, and found in it a child's tin whistle green, with age, a lock of pale hair tied with a scrap of blue ribbon, and a tintype, no bigger than his palm, of a woman standing beside a boy of 6 or 7, with his hand on the head of a dog. He set the tintype on the mantel next to the plate. Then he sat down on the puncheon floor, with his back to the hearth, and unfolded the paper, and read it by the light from the open door. To whoever finds this, the letter began, "My name is Adeline Marsh, and I came into this valley in the spring of the year my husband John died of the black lung in the diggings at Cold Fork, and I built this cabin with the help of a man named Perkins, who took $2 for his time and would not take more. I lived here 9 years. My boy Thomas is buried on the bench above the spring, under the flat stone, with no name on it, because I could not bring myself to cut his name and then leave him. He was 7 years old when the fever took him, and he was the best of us. I am writing this because I am old now, and my hands are not steady, and I do not know if I will see another spring, and I do not want the money I saved to go into the ground with me. There is $82 in gold and 11 in silver, which is every coin I put by from the eggs and the butter, and the small mending I did for the men who came through. And it is not much, but it is honest, and it was saved slow. If you are reading this, you are in my house, and you are welcome to it. Mend what is broken. Keep the flue clean. Do not disturb the stone on the bench. If you have lost someone, know that this house was built by a woman who had lost everyone, and it still stood. I hope you are not too tired when you find this. I hope there is still light in the door. Adeline Marsh, widow, of this valley, 9 years. He folded the letter along its original creases, set it inside the tin box beside the whistle and the ribbon, and put the box on the mantel, next to the tintype and the tin plate. Then he stood up and went to work. He mended the puncheon slab back into its place, with a fresh peg cut from oak deadfall, drove it flush with the back of the axe head, and set the coins in a small leather pouch he hung from a nail behind the mantel where he could see it. He did not yet spend any of it. He wrote out in his own hand on the back of a scrap of the same oilcloth an accounting of what he had found, dated it, and folded it into the tin box under the whistle, because he had learned from Rennick that a record kept was a debt named. The cabin needed a full season of work, and he set the sequence in his mind, the way his father had taught him to set a shoeing job: worst first, then structural, then finish. He cut a stand of straight lodgepole a mile up the creek with a Swede saw he traded a hinge for at a mining camp 2 days out, dragged the poles in by hand because he had no draft animal, and repoled the failing quarter of the roof over the door. He laid fresh split shakes over the poles, then sawed cut in, even rectangles from the creek bank, tamped down with the flat of a spade. He rechinked the whole cabin round with clay and horsehair, working from the bottom courses up, letting each course dry a day before the next. He hung a new door on strap hinges. He beat out cold at a borrowed forge in a place called Miller's Bend, 6 miles south by the game trail, where a man named August Reinke, 53, a Bohemian smith with 2 fingers gone on his left hand, let him use the fire in exchange for shoeing 4 mules and mending a wagon tongue. August asked no questions about where the stranger had come from, and only said, when Daniel finished the last mule, that a man who could set a shoe like that would not go hungry in this country. Others came in by 1s and 2s across that first summer. A woman named Hattie Bourne, 41, widowed, who ran a mail stop at the mouth of the valley, rode up the trail on a gray mare one morning, with a covered basket, and left him a loaf of sourdough, a jar of plum preserves, and the news that his valley had once been called Marsh's Hollow by the older people, and that she had known Adeline by sight, but not to speak to. She did not stay. A trapper named Otis Freed, 67, brought a haunch of venison in the fall, and traded it for a mended trap spring. A boy of 14, named Willem Koss, whose father ran sheep on the south bench, came up to watch the forge Daniel set under a lean-to behind the cabin, and Daniel showed him how to hold a hoof between his knees and how to read the grain of iron by the color it turned in the fire. Willem came back every Saturday through the winter. A man named Reverend Amos Pettigrew, 70, riding a circuit between 3 settlements, stopped one evening, ate beans at the trestle table, and offered without being asked to say a word over the stone on the bench above the spring. And Daniel let him, and the Reverend spoke only the name Thomas Marsh, aged 7, beloved, and rode out again at dawn. By the second summer the cabin no longer looked abandoned. Daniel had cleared the corral and rebuilt the poles in a proper 3-rail, with mortise joints cut with a chisel he traded a pair of hinges for. He had cut a woodshed lean-to on the north side, stacked 2 cords of pine split and seasoned, and laid a flat flagstone step at the door. He had bought from August Reinke, at fair price and in silver, from Adeline's pouch, a used anvil of 140 pounds, a leg vise, and a small bellows, and set them under the lean-to on a pounded earth floor with a chimney of fieldstone that drew clean the first time he lit it. He shod horses for the men who came through the valley on the way to the diggings above Cold Fork, and he mended wagon iron and cut door hardware for the small houses going up along the creek at the south end. He charged what the work was worth, and no more, and men remembered it. He paid Hattie Bourne 50 cents a month to carry any letter he might want to send, though for the first 2 years he sent none. People came to know his name as Daniel Carter, Smith, of the Hollow, and they said it that way without thinking. Willem Koss turned 16 and asked to be taken on as an apprentice, and Daniel took him on the same terms Rennick had once taken him. Room, board, no wage, and the trade taught honest. Hattie Bourne stopped one Sunday a month on her mail ride, and left a loaf and a jar, and stayed a quarter hour at the trestle table, with a cup of chicory coffee, and neither of them called it anything more than what it was. August Reinke rode up twice a year, and stood at the forge with his ruined hand in his pocket, and watched Daniel work, and once said only, "That fire draws better than mine," and rode home. Reverend Pettigrew came in the spring, and in the fall, and each time walked up to the bench above the spring, and stood a minute beside the flat stone, and then came back down, and ate at the table, and left before dark. Otis Freed brought a haunch of venison every November, and would not take pay for it. And every November, Daniel gave him a new set trap in return, and the exchange became a thing the two men counted the year by. The tin plate stayed on the mantel next to the tin type and the tin box, and Daniel did not put anything else on the mantel because there was no room and no need. On winter evenings he poured 2 cups of chicory coffee, one for himself, and one that he set across the table from him, out of habit, from Rennick's 2-room shop above the creek at Bellwether Crossing, and he did not think of it as strange because no one was there to see it. He kept the flue clean, as the letter had asked. He did not disturb the stone on the bench. He mended what broke as it broke, and each spring he walked the roof and retamped the sod where the winter had lifted it, and each fall he laid in wood and salt and flour against the snow, and the cabin stood, as Adeline Marsh had written that it would. In the spring of the year, Daniel Carter turned 71, 40 years to the month after he had ridden out of Dry Creek with a canvas sack tied behind the cantle. He saddled a bay gelding that Willem Cass, now a man of 54, with a smith of his own, down at the mouth of the valley, had picked out for him and would not let him pay for. He rode east out of the hollow at a walk, alone, with Rennick's pocket-knife in his right front pocket, a folding shovel in his roll, and no plan but the shape of 3 trees, a bend in a creek, and the angle of a limestone outcrop above the water. It took him 9 days to reach the timber. His shoulders no longer burned when he dug. They simply refused, and he rested twice, for every foot of dirt lifted, beneath the rotted log, beneath the needles, beneath the oilcloth folded once, the way Rennick had folded oilcloth over the antler-handled knife. The canvas sack was still there. The jute twine broke in his fingers. The paper money inside was mottled and dark at the edges, and smelled of the ground. He sat back on his heels in the pine duff, and looked at it a long time. He did not count it. He thought of the man on the stoop, whose name he had learned only on the ride down, and of the 4 faces in the office, and of the story he had told himself before he pushed open the back door, and he understood that the sack had never been his, and would not become his, by being lifted a second time. He carried it out of the timber all the same. He rode 9 days back at the same walk. When he came into the hollow at dusk on the 18th day, Willem was at the forge, and Hattie Bourne's granddaughter, who ran the mail stop now that Hattie was buried on the south bench beside her husband, was leaving a loaf on the trestle table. Daniel unsaddled the bay, hung the sack from the nail behind the mantel, where Adeline Marsh's leather pouch had hung for 40 years, and sat on the puncheon floor with his back to the hearth as he had the first day. He did not spend $1 of it. In the tin box, under the whistle, and the ribbon, and the letter, and the dated accounting on the scrap of oilcloth, he folded a second accounting in his own hand of what the sack held and where it had come from, and the names, so far as he could remember them, of the 5 men who had died in the office in Dry Creek, because Rennick had taught him that a record kept was a debt named. He set the tin plate, the tin type, the tin box, and now the canvas sack on the mantel, and there was room for all of them, and no need for anything else. He was 71, and he was home. He had been 31, and the only man still standing. And he had ridden out of Dry Creek with a sack he had not earned and no plan for it. And he had spent 40 years learning what he had instead. It was the best 40 years a man could spend. If this story sat with you, the way Daniel sat with the hearth at his back, on the first day in the hollow, take a moment before you move on to the next thing. Leave a like so the channel knows to keep telling stories at this pace, in this voice, about men and women who were written off and quietly outlasted the writing. Subscribe if you have not, and turn the bell on, because the next story is already being set down the way this one was, one plank at a time. Tell us in the comments where you are watching from tonight. The town, the county, the porch, the kitchen table, the cab of the truck at the end of a long shift, because the people who gather around these stories are part of what makes them worth telling, and Daniel would have wanted the names written down. And before you go, sit with this one question, and answer it honestly to yourself, if to no one else. There is something in your own life that you were handed, or found, or stumbled into, that other people looked at and called worthless. A house nobody wanted, a trade nobody respected, a person nobody else saw, a quiet skill your hands learned from someone who is no longer here to see what you have done with it, a piece of ground, a room, a second chance, a letter in a drawer, a name in a Bible, a debt someone forgave you when you could not have paid it. What have you built on top of that overlooked thing? And what would the person who left it to you say if they could sit at your table tonight and pour a second cup of chicory coffee across from your own? Say their name out loud once before you sleep. That is the whole of it. That is what Daniel Carter did every winter evening in a cabin in a valley that older people had once called Marsh's Hollow, and it is what the story has been about from the first line. Ride easy, and we will see you at the next fire.